Now, the title of my paper is, Are We All Originalists Now? I Hope Not. Yesterday, Larry Alexander characterized himself as a skunk at the picnic, and I think that goes tenfold for me here. Now, why do I hope we are not all originalists now? Well, I quote Richard Posner on page 24. He confessed to a visceral dislike of academic moralism. That's folks like Dworkin and me. A body of literature bringing normative moral and political theory to bear in legal analysis. He wrote, a lot of it strikes me as prissy, hermetic, censorious, naive, sanctimonious, self-congratulatory, and insipid. Well, I won't say anything of the sort about originalists, though I will admit that before dinner last night, I drank a microbrew ale called Stone's Sublimely Self-Righteous Ale and loved it. At the same time, Larry Solem, a new originalist, drank an arrogant bastard ale, and it seemed to suit him quite well. Okay. Now, I want to briefly mention, without elaborating, 4 points I make in the paper. First, in response to the question, are we all originalists now, I sketch what I call the balkanization of originalism, as well as the balkanization of originalism. The balkanization is when originalism splits into warring camps. And Tom, it was Mitch Berman who said there are 72 varieties of originalism now. So I sketched that. The balkanization of originalism is, of course, what happens when Jack, hitherto pragmatic living constitutionalist, becomes an originalist. Jack, you just missed my invocation of my idea of the balkanization of originalism, as well as the balkanization of originalism. So I turn the question, are we all originalists now, around, and I ask, are we all moral readers now? Now, my second point is to argue that there is a trick in the question, are we all originalists now? I get into this on pages 10 to 12. I argue that answering the question affirmatively presupposes what I call the originalist premise. Now, the originalist premise is the assumption that originalism, rightly conceived, is the best, or indeed the only conception of fidelity and constitutional interpretation. Or put more strongly, it's the assumption that originalism, rightly conceived, has to be the best, or indeed the only conception of constitutional interpretation. Now, why so? Well, because originalism, rightly conceived, just has to be, by definition, in the nature of things, in the nature of the Constitution, in the nature of law, in the nature of interpretation, in the nature of fidelity and constitutional interpretation. And worse yet, I argue that raising the question, are we all originalists now, may presuppose that we've all come around to Scalia's and Bork's way of thinking without conceding that their versions of originalism themselves are moving targets that have moved considerably toward the positions of their critics. And I illustrate this point with a pop quiz on originalism on 11 to 12, where I quote a passage and ask who wrote it. Now, the correct answer, surprisingly, I won't go through the passage, I'm assuming that you've all read it. The correct answer is that Bork wrote this passage, and I think that the passage shows, whether or not Bork would admit it, that he's made spectacular concessions to critics of originalism like Dworkin. Now, third, I show that contrary to their claims and assumptions, originalists do not have a monopoly on concern for fidelity and constitutional interpretation. I mention a big symposium we held at Fordham some years ago on fidelity and constitutional theory, and that symposium implicitly challenged the narrow originalist claim to a monopoly on fidelity, for it featured several competing conceptions of fidelity. Dworkin's understanding of fidelity as pursuing integrity with a moral reading of the Constitution. Actually, Tom mentioned some of these. Bruce Ackerman's understanding of fidelity as synthesis of constitutional moments. Larry Lessig's understanding of fidelity as translation across generations, and Jack Rakov was there too. His understanding of fidelity is keeping faith with the founder's vision. And Jack was there. I asked Jack for that conference, I asked Jack to write a paper, does the Constitution deserve our fidelity? And I think, I fear that since then, Jack has fallen into the originalist premise trap of thinking that if we care about fidelity, we must be originalists. Now, third, if I hope we're not all originalists now, what do I hope we are? I get into this toward the end of the paper. First, I speak to the limitations of history. I argue that in a post-originalist world would give due regard to original understanding and history and constitutional interpretation without being originalist. In a post-originalist world, we would embrace Dworkin's idea that there are two dimensions of best interpretation, fit and justification, and we would understand that fidelity in constitutional interpretation is not purely a matter of fit with historical materials, but also a matter of justification in political theory. Fit and history do have a role to play in the quest for fidelity and constitutional interpretation, but a limited one. And I make some arguments about how history can't take us all the way to settling disputes about competing understandings of constitutional interpretation. Now, I make an argument about the misconceived quest for the original public meaning, and I want to go over this to link up with the colloquy yesterday between the two panels with Kurt's paper and Randy's paper. Some new originalists seem to think they can overcome the limitations of the old originalism and the use of history and constitutional interpretation by reconceiving the quest from intention of the framers or original understanding to original public meaning. Now, I argue that the new originalists may have reconceived their quest, but their new quest for original public meaning is likewise misconceived. Obviously, I'm playing on Paul Brest's classic title, The Misconceived Quest for the Original Understanding. Now, why do I think the quest for original public meaning is misconceived? Well, I think it's misconceived because on most important questions, there will not be a definitive original public meaning as an historical fact of the matter that will be useful in resolving our disagreements, much less our problems. And I give a hypothetical example. Let's imagine in the near future that the Supreme Court overturns Lawrence versus Texas, and let's imagine that we, the people, amend the Constitution by adopting the following 28th Amendment. Well-ordered liberty being necessary to the happiness of a free state, the right to autonomy shall not be infringed. Now, what would be the original public meaning of the 28th Amendment? Well, I distinguish two quite different understandings, which parallel recognizable disagreements between originalists and moral readers of the Constitution. On the one hand, originalists like Scalia, who want to construe constitutional language narrowly, might say that the original public meaning was simply, specifically, and exclusively to reinstate the narrow holding of Lawrence versus Texas. Such originalists might say that the 28th Amendment protects only the right of gays and lesbians to engage in, quote, deviant sexual intercourse, as the Texas statute invalidated in Lawrence had put it. So on their view, the 28th Amendment would be no more abstract a commitment to a right to autonomy than that. Now, on the other hand, moral readers who conceive the Constitution as a charter of abstract commitments and principles would say that the original public meaning was nothing less than to ratify the right to autonomy that the Supreme Court had developed through the line of cases from Meyer and Pierce on through Griswold, Roe, Casey, and Lawrence. Moreover, they would claim that the original public meaning was to authorize the Supreme Court to go on as it had before in these cases, elaborating our basic commitment to a right to autonomy. Now, let's observe that there would be no independent, definitive, original public meaning that either side could resort to in order definitively to resolve their disagreements. Proponents of both understandings of the 28th Amendment would claim that their understanding was faithful to the original public meaning. Two additional observations are in order here. One, there would not be some definitive original public meaning of the words right to autonomy that would resolve our disputes, any more than that there is out there in our constitutional culture right now a core public meaning of the right to autonomy. And second, there is no term of art, right to autonomy, to which we could resort to resolve disagreement over the meaning of the right to autonomy. Those who are learned in the law would vehemently disagree among themselves about it. And so likewise it is with the Privileges or Immunities Clause. The same goes for the Equal Protection Clause, and so it ever shall be with all significant constitutional provisions. Finally, I sketch at the very end, I guess it's kind of like a list of approved authors, people whose work demonstrates what I call a post-originalist use of history. And I won't go through them one by one, but I think they offer glimpses of what the use of history and constitutional interpretation would look like in a post-originalist world. And I suggest that a post-originalist world would look somewhat like the pre-originalist world, that is, the pre-Borkian world, although it would be far more sophisticated theoretically than that world was. It would treat original understanding as one source of constitutional meaning among several, not the exclusive source, let alone the exclusive legitimate theory. It would use history for what it teaches rather than for what it purportedly decides for us. And in a post-originalist world, we would understand that history is a jumble of open possibilities, not authoritative determinate answers. And we would understand that we, self-styled originalists, no less than the rest of us, always read the past selectively from the standpoint of the present in anticipation of the future. We look to the past not for authoritative answers, but for illumination about our experience and our commitments. All of the post-originalists I have commended understand this, as does Jack Balkan, as he's put so well both in his chapter and in his remarks today. Finally, we would understand that it dishonors the past to pretend, in the name of originalism, that it authoritatively decides questions for us, and to pretend that it avoids the burden of making normative arguments about the meaning of our commitment to abstract moral principles and ends. Fidelity in interpreting the Constitution as written, I argue, requires a philosophic approach to constitutional interpretation. No approach, including no version of originalism, can responsibly avoid philosophic reflection and choice in interpreting the Constitution. And I make a book-length argument in my book with Stott Barber, Constitutional Interpretation, The Basic Questions, that all of the approaches that aim and claim to avoid making moral and philosophic choices in constitutional interpretation inevitably make those choices, and that all of the sources they invoke to avoid making philosophic choices are sites for making philosophic choices, not approaches that avoid philosophic choices. Let me just stop there then.